So now we're turning our attention to cellular respiration. And so cellular respiration is going to be the process of breaking down sugar molecules in order to make energy for your cells. And so the cellular respiration is going to take place in the mitochondria. And so if you look at the equation for cellular respiration, we have glucose plus oxygen is going to end up yielding carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. And so all we're doing is we're taking these atoms of glucose and oxygen and we're rearranging them so that we end up with carbon dioxide, water, and energy along the way. And so I want to give y'all kind of a brief overview before we kind of delve in. So, and I'm going to leave this up here so because I think it'll kind of help y'all, you know, muddle through the process. So what's going to happen, what we're going to do is we're going to take electrons away from glucose and we're going to give them to oxygen. So once we add electrons to oxygen, which part of this do you think it's going to become? Maybe the water? So when you add a couple of electrons to oxygen, you're going to end up making water. And again, we're taking those electrons from glucose and giving them to oxygen. And then once they give them to oxygen, they become water. Now, once you break down glucose, you're stripping these electrons away from it. So once you remove a lot of those electrons, you're going to be left with a molecule of carbon dioxide. And since we're removing electrons from carbon dioxide, we say glucose is being oxidized. And so glucose is being oxidized to make carbon dioxide, and oxygen is being reduced, or you're adding electrons to oxygen to become water. And then we're going to end up with lots and lots of energy at the end. And so I just wanted to give you the normal flow of where these electrons are moving and what's starting and what's becoming what. So just keep in mind, we're taking electrons away from glucose and giving them to oxygen. Once you add those electrons to oxygen, you're going to end up with water. And then once you remove those electrons from glucose, that's going to become carbon dioxide. And then we're going to release a lot of energy in the process. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. Alright, so cellular respiration is going to be essential to every living organism. Every single thing that ever lived has done cellular respiration. And so cellular respiration, again, is this process of breaking down sugar and making energy for your cells, because your cells can't live or function without energy. And so this cellular respiration, again, is going to occur in the mitochondria. And the reactants, we've got these sugars, or glucose, and oxygen. And after cellular respiration, you end up with carbon dioxide and water, and making some ATP along the way. So is cellular respiration going to be an endergonic or an exergonic reaction? Exergonic, right? It's making energy. It's releasing energy. And so you can tell that it's exergonic because the ATP is in the products. If the ATP was in the reactants, that tells you that it needs energy to proceed. So that would be an endergonic. But cellular respiration is going to be an exergonic process. And so after cellular respiration, you end up with carbon dioxide and water. Those actually serve as the reactants for photosynthesis, which is what we'll discuss next chapter. And so in photosynthesis, you're starting with carbon dioxide and water and energy from the sun, and it's going to be used to synthesize sugars and oxygen. So the equations for cellular respiration and photosynthesis are totally opposite of one another. So if cellular respiration is exergonic, what do you think photosynthesis will be? Endergonic, because every reaction has an opposite reaction. Alright, photosynthesis is the opposite reaction of cellular respiration. So if one of them is exergonic, that means the other one has to be endergonic. And so these two pathways work together in order to not only make energy, but also to make sugar molecules. And so when we're talking about respiration, there's actually several different kinds of respiration that can occur. What we're going to be focusing on today is called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the exact same thing as aerobic respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen. And if you don't have oxygen present, then you can go to a different pathway, which is called anaerobic respiration. And the difference between the two is whether or not oxygen is going to be present. So if oxygen's around, you're going to be using aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. If it's not around, you're going to be using anaerobic respiration. And another type of respiration is actually called fermentation. So this is what a lot of yeasts and bacteria are going to do. Actually, humans are capable of fermenting as well. But all of these are starting with molecules of glucose, and they're starting to break them down, and they're all ways to harvest energy. Now, the most efficient way to do it is aerobic respiration with oxygen. And so, but at the end of the lecture, we'll discuss different types of aerobic respiration and fermentation. But like we said, we're focusing on this aerobic respiration with oxygen as present. So again, we're starting with a molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6. We're taking electrons away from glucose and giving them to water. Once we strip those electrons away from glucose, it's going to become carbon dioxide. And once we add those electrons to oxygen, that's going to give us water. And then we're going to release energy along the way. Yeah?
What did you say the difference is in fermentation and aerobic respiration?
So fermentation is kind of an organism-specific thing. And so usually a lot of times it's bacteria and yeast. But like I said, you can throw us into that bunch too, because we'll use a type of fermentation. And so the anaerobic, this specifically means without oxygen. Now fermentation can occur with or without oxygen, whereas anaerobic is purely without oxygen, and aerobic is purely with oxygen. All right, so before we kind of delve into the processes involved in cellular respiration, we need to talk about some terminology. And so cellular respiration and all of your biochemical pathways in general are a series of what's called redox reactions. And so that redox stands for reduction and oxidation. And these are two processes that are constantly going on between all of these molecules and these pathways of metabolism. And so whenever you oxidize something, you're taking electrons away from it. So in the case of cellular respiration, because we're removing electrons from glucose, we're oxidizing it. So anytime you oxidize something, you're breaking it down, right? You're taking electrons away from it. Whereas in a reduction, you're adding electrons, or you're accepting electrons. So in this case, oxygen is accepting the electrons from glucose. So when you add those electrons to oxygen, you say oxygen is being reduced. And I know it seems funny because you would think that if it was reduced, it would lose electrons. But what it's talking about is a reduction in positive charge. So since you're removing electrons, which are negatively charged, you're adding them to oxygen. So it's becoming more negative, which means there's a reduction in the positive amount. So that's where the term reduction comes from. It's not talking about the reduction in negative charge, it's talking about the reduction in positive charge. So in an oxidation, you're giving electrons away, and in a reduction, you're accepting electrons. And so in cellular respiration, glucose is going to be oxidized to become carbon dioxide, and oxygen is going to be reduced to form water. And so these different redox reactions, for every oxidation, you're going to have a reduction somewhere. So they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And so these type of reactions are usually going to occur between a fuel and oxygen. In this case, our fuel is glucose. And so this fuel is providing the electrons necessary to build water and to be broken down into carbon dioxide. And so again, this reaction is going to be exergonic because we're going to end up releasing energy along the way. So here, if you look at this redox reaction here, all right, we have this electron donor X. So he's going to be giving away his electron. So when he gives away his electron, he becomes oxidized. And then we have the electron acceptor. Once this accepts the electrons, we say that it's become reduced. So oxidation is giving away electrons, and reduction is accepting those electrons. And so when we're talking about cellular respiration, again, we're saying sugar is being oxidized to become carbon dioxide, and oxygen is becoming reduced in order to make water. And so in this case, the fuel is always going to be oxidized, meaning glucose pretty much is always going to be oxidized, and then the oxygen is always going to be reduced in cellular respiration. And so when we're taking these electrons away from glucose, all right, they can't just leave on their own and go where they want. They need to have an electron carrier. And there's several different electron carriers that we're going to talk about over the next couple of lectures. We're going to have NAD positive, FAD, and NADP positive. Now all of these guys are going to serve as electron carriers. And so what that means is they're going to help take the electrons where they need to go. So in the case of cellular respiration, you're removing these electrons from glucose. And once they get removed from glucose, they're going to land on one of these electron carriers. And so just think of this electron carrier as kind of like a taxi cab for the electrons, right? So it takes them where they need to go. So you're removing these electrons from glucose, you're giving them to these electron carriers, and then those electron carriers are what carry it to oxygen. And so the first electron carrier that we're going to talk about is this NAD positive. And so this stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. You don't need to know that, but you definitely need to understand what NAD is. And so this is in the oxidized form. It does not have the electron yet. But once you take these electrons away from glucose, those electrons are going to be given to this NAD positive. And so those electrons are going to be held in the form of this oxygen right here. So once your electron carrier has been loaded up with electrons, it's going to be in the form of NADH. And so that H tells you that the electrons are on board the electron carrier. If it's in this form, then you know that it doesn't have the electrons with it. And so since we're adding electrons to this, we're saying the NAD positive is being reduced to NADH. And all of these other ones are going to work the exact same way. They're just going to be different molecules. So all of these, when they're loaded up with an electron or two, are going to have an extra H attached to them. And so, again, this is what we're going to use in order to take those electrons away from glucose and to give them to oxygen. And so, when you're talking about these electron acceptors, right? So we're taking electrons away from glucose and we're trying to give them to water. All right, that's what we're trying to do first. And so, once we have taken all of these electrons away from glucose, we've loaded up all of our NADHs and our FADHs. Now that we have these electrons in the form of these hydrogens, now what we're going to do is we're going to give them to oxygen. But it's a kind of a complicated process. It's not that easy. So what's going to happen is we're going to go through something that's called an electron transport chain. An electron transport chain is a series of proteins in the plasma membrane, not the plasma membrane, but the mitochondrial membrane. And so we spend the first half of cellular respiration taking electrons away from glucose and then making our little electron carriers. And so once those electrons are on those electron carriers, the next thing to do is to give it to oxygen. So the way they give those electrons to oxygen is through this electron transport chain. And so again, this is just going to be a series of proteins in the mitochondrial membrane. And so these NADs and FADs will donate their electrons. They'll become oxidized, right, because they're losing electrons. And so they're going to give this electron to this first protein. And then this protein is going to turn around and give it to that protein. And then this one's going to turn around and give it to that. And so forth and so on until it gets passed all the way down the electron transport chain. And then at the bottom of the electron transport chain, we have something that's called the final electron acceptor. In aerobic or cellular respiration, this is always going to be oxygen. Now in anaerobic respiration, the only difference between anaerobic and aerobic is this final electron acceptor. So in aerobic respiration, it's always going to be oxygen. In anaerobic, it's going to be something else other than oxygen. Maybe a sulfur, maybe a nitrogen, maybe a sulfate group. It's just anything other than oxygen. So that's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic. Anyways, this electron transport chain is going to be actually a series of redox reactions occurring. Because you're accepting an electron and then you're donating an electron. You're accepting an electron and then you're donating an electron. And so once these electrons reach, when you add these electrons to oxygen, you're going to end up making water. So this is where we get this water in cellular respiration. And so don't worry, we'll go over this process many more times before today, so don't be bogged down by all of it. Okay, so we've already said we're taking these electrons away from glucose, and we're adding them to these electron carriers. And so again, when you see the NADH or the FADH, that tells you that it's loaded up with electrons. So the electrons are leaving glucose, they're getting in their little electron carrier, and then they're going to be dropped off at the electron transport chain so they can meet up with oxygen. So this is kind of the flow of electrons in cellular respiration. And again, it's going to be exergonic because we're going to end up releasing energy along the way. So some might think, why do you have to go through this whole complicated process of the electron transport chain? Why can't you just give the electrons to oxygen? Well, if you did that, this process would release so much energy so fast, it would almost be like an explosion of energy. So much energy is released that your cell isn't going to be able to capture it all. And so it's a less efficient way to do this versus if you do it in a stepwise fashion, so a little bit at a time, you're creating manageable amounts of energy that can actually be used by the cell. And so this electron transport chain is what is helping do this in a stepwise fashion. So it basically slows the movement of electrons to oxygen. But along the way, as we'll talk about in a little bit, as these electrons pass down the electron transport chain, we're going to generate a little bit of energy at a time. So it's a lot easier for your cell to handle a slower, more calm process than one that's all of a sudden going to produce all this energy and then your cell freaks out because it can't harvest it all. So this is why we use the electron transport chain, to make it a more efficient process. Alright, so when we're talking about cellular respiration, there are going to be three main processes. And so we're going to keep track of them on the board. So we've got cellular respiration. The first step is going to be glycolysis. The second step is going to be the Krebs cycle. And then the third step is going to be oxidative phosphorylation. And an oxidative phosphorylation is made up of the electron transport chain, and then that's followed by a process called chemiosmosis. All right, so what's going to happen? Glycolysis is the process of starting that initial oxidation of glucose. So it's going to start breaking down glucose. And so it's going to begin the oxidation of glucose. So its main function is to oxidize glucose. Now at the end of glycolysis, you're going to end up with 2 molecules of pyruvate. So essentially, glycolysis literally means to break sugar. Glyco is sugar, lysis is to break. So glycolysis is breaking glucose in half to make 2 pyruvates. And then those 2 pyruvates will enter into the next phase of cellular respiration, which is the Krebs cycle. The main job of the Krebs cycle is to complete the oxidation of glucose. So we start breaking it down in glycolysis, and then we finish breaking it down in the Krebs cycle. And remember, all we're doing, we're starting with glucose, and then once we take those electrons away from it, it's going to become carbon dioxide. So the Krebs cycle is going to release a bunch of carbon dioxide, which tells you that glucose has been completely oxidized. It's been completely broken down. And it's been broken down into carbon dioxide.